And it's so good to be here. Yeah, like you said, I've been traveling around, and this is my last stop before I return back home. So I'm very excited to kind of see the rest of the island later today. So far, it's pretty much been the airport here and my hotel. So I'm excited to see. Yes, well, we have the whole day to explore, from what I hear. So I'm excited for that. But yeah, I'm here to share a little bit about Grand Farm and kind of. Um, what Grand Farm is and kind of how the community got involved with Grand Farm and what we're trying to accomplish with it. Because, like Mark said, there's some similarities between what Fargo is kind of built around and some of the different things here as well. So hopefully this can kind of inspire you all, show an example of something that we're just getting started on. It's certainly just a few years old at this point, so but certainly maturing as we continue to build. So um, so yeah, a little bit about me. I'm Nathan Marcotte. I come from a background of kind of community building, entrepreneurship, and technology. And so with Grand Farm, I've been really focused around the technology side and how that applies into agriculture. Certainly, agriculture looks a little bit different in each region and area. So, in our area, we've been looking at some of the different autonomous systems, IoT, and how those kind of support the challenges that we're facing in our area. Um, that is a pretty large tractor, but that one is kind of fun. It's fully autonomous if you're running it in that mode, or it's I'm driving it in that case. So, um, but yeah, a little bit about Fargo and kind of the community that we're built upon and what enabled Grand Farm to kind of be able to take off and grow in Fargo is that we're really focused on community, and it has parallels to here. I mean, this is a gathering we have every single week where we have different entrepreneurs and ideas being shared. And also, you can see the beautiful summer weather there, which isn't always the case. Our winters get very cold and summers get hot as well. Um, I included this photo just for fun. This is last winter. It was a blizzard snowstorm, and we had to go out and get ice cream. So um, it's kind of fun to see that. But that is a challenge that our area faces is how do we kind of embrace winter to have that community that wants to stay and grow in Fargo? And so there's been some really fantastic groups in our area that have been building upon that, especially with our this is an example. One of them, the Chris Kindle Market. They host an outdoor winter kind of market, and it's been really fun to kind of get people outside in the winter because generally we all want to stay inside or go vacation elsewhere. So, um, yeah, that's a little bit about Fargo. So, talking a little bit about Grand Farm and what we are. So, we're a non-government organization, so private organization that's nonprofit in nature, where we're really focused on bringing together different groups that all are part of the agriculture ecosystem. So, what we mean by that is talking about our farmers and growers, people making technology, the companies that are historically working in the agriculture space. Um, Education is a really big piece of it as well, and policymakers and government to support policy that's favorable for some of these new practices within agriculture. So bringing all those different groups together, we see really interesting things happen. I mean, a lot of conversations are started about what's possible and how we can maybe do things better. Um, and through that work, we host a lot of different events and conferences, workshops, and also facilitate different projects that we have happening at a test farm that we operate. So just a tiny bit about the background of Grand Farm. We first got started in 2017, so we're not that old at this point. But as you can see, it started with just an idea, kind of talking about like, why don't we do something around agriculture technology, especially because the Fargo region, North Dakota in general, there's a lot of agriculture activity that's been really historical there and continues to grow. And so I was thinking about how can we pair kind of the historical agriculture that we have with the technology to enable different practices. So that's the very early start. We were had very scrappy start. We got some land donated to kind of use on a temporary basis. It created a lot of attention around what we were doing there. And as we were creating that tension, more and more people wanted to get involved and kind of see what was possible. Um, and so now, a few years in, we have our test farm and we have lots of really strong engagement around those groups. So, like I mentioned, Grand Farm is built kind of around all the different groups in agriculture. We know that we can't really do anything on ourselves without the support and involvement from all the other different people involved in the agriculture industry. So, like I mentioned, those are kind of the main groups we work with, but really focused on the farmers leading the innovation and like listening to them and the challenges that they're facing in agriculture. We do some fun conferences, which are uh, part of the strategy to really bring people together. So we have our Cultivate conference, which focuses around agriculture technology, kind of talking about what are the new innovations and maybe how can they be applied. We know with a lot of this new technology, it's kind of unproven or there's barriers to adoption for it. I mean, some of those are just uncertainty if it'll work. Cost is a big factor as well. So kind of having these conferences and through some of the work that we do on our test farm, we can kind of help de-risk that technology to make the adoption easier for the farmers in our area. Um, we also see a lot of autonomous technologies. So we organized a conference to kind of talk around those topics and explore some of that technology. So this is probably an area where policy plays one of the bigger roles in enabling the technology, especially when we're talking about drones and different things like that. That's just an example of how policy plays into some of the work that we're doing. Policy looks very different in other areas of what's a roadblock, but um, policy is important there. And then space agriculture, this started as kind of a crazy idea of just dreaming about like what would it look like to grow food um, out of this world, basically. And it was kind of a big moonshot idea, but we saw so many of those parallels actually look like indoor growing and greenhouses and vertical farming. Um, and also, we have really strong engagement with our elementary students in that conference, just to get them excited about space and growing their own food because that's definitely a shift that we're seeing as well. Less and less people are tied to the source of their food or being involved in the growing process. Just briefly wanted to mention that some of the work that comes out of those conferences and events is the conversation has started, but there's the work to be done. And so that's some of the activities that we have happening with our test farm that we operate is really trying to demonstrate and validate those technologies that we're seeing. Um, so we operate our own farm. It's not a production farm, but we operate kind of small test plots to kind of test technologies on our campus. So I think I have a photo of that coming up. So this is an area that we're calling our Grand Farm Innovation Campus. It's just a little bit outside of Fargo, North Dakota. And it's an area where we have test plots to demonstrate different technologies kind of impacting our region. In Fargo, we do a lot of broad acreage agriculture, a lot of corn, sunflower, sugar beets, things like that. Um, and so that's kind of what our campus is all about, is growing those things and testing the new technologies on top of that. One example was last summer with no-till practices, layers and layers of residue kind of form on the top of the soil. So being able to cut through that gets a little bit more difficult with some of the different planters. So a startup was experimenting with using water jets to kind of pierce through and open up that residue. Um, and they had really good results with that type of work. So those are the things that we kind of want to showcase because as a farmer, seeing that technology, it's potentially unproven. You don't know like how it'll impact yields and things like that. So we see Grand Farm as kind of that playground or an area that we can test and de-risk some of those different technologies. And then, of course, we know a lot of the work happens just bringing people together. So being able to kind of have spaces to bring people together, kind of like what we are in here is really important as well. And like I mentioned, like the work that we do isn't possible without the involvement from all the different groups that we have. So that's one thing that we've been really um, that's been really important to our growth is being able to get other people involved. And this is some of the different organizations that are in our region that have been involved with Grand Farm. So um, it's been really important there. So um, kind of talking a little bit more about agriculture in general and some of the different challenges that we're seeing. So, like I mentioned, agriculture looks very different in different areas. And one of the main things that we're facing in Fargo, and also it sounds like here as well, is the workforce shortage, thinking about how can we continue to grow all of our own food and things like that with more limited people to do the work in a sense. So automation has definitely been kind of proposed as an area that can kind of help support that work, especially through a safety lens, potentially with some dangerous jobs being automated, but then also just kind of supplementing the existing workforce. So that's one area where we've been seeing a lot of automation. Um, but then also kind of thinking about that problem and solution mindset. A lot of our other work has been looking at like what are the problems that our growers are facing in the area, and is there technology that can help support those challenges rather than just having technology and trying to apply technology just because it's available. Um, so that's one area where we've been seeing a little bit of technology assisting in some of the challenges we're seeing. And then thinking about kind of what it took to start Grand Farm and why um, we've we've kind of had the success we've had so far, and a lot of that has been with the community supporting it and being involved. Um, Without that, Grand Farm wouldn't really exist. So we've been able to form those connections between all the different groups. Um, and also looking to create impact where the activity is happening. So in the US, we see a lot of startups that are kind of located on our coastal areas, like Silicon Valley. They're known for their large startup hubs, but they're not so much focused on agriculture. So the idea was, can we build Fargo, North Dakota as the center of agriculture innovation in our region? Just because we know that innovation needs to stay close, and it's been really exciting to see where some of that innovation happens, especially when farmers have the ideas themselves and thinking about how that technology can be applied. Some of these didn't quite load in this view, but um, I just wanted to talk through maybe like two examples where we've kind of seen the success of um, these technologies. So I have some photos I can show you after because they're not loading here, but thinking about artificial intelligence and autonomy, that's been a really hot topic, and for good reason. I mean, there's a lot of different things that all kind of came together to start to enable these technologies to be applied. Um, into agriculture. And I mean, a lot of that has to do with computers being fast enough to enable, say, autonomous weeding robots, because one of the challenges we face is some of our weeds are becoming resistant to different chemicals, and there's different chemical bans. So it's looking at what are the different ways we can solve those problems. And one of those has been using robots that have mechanical hose and things like that to remove the weeds and without chemicals. Um, I have a little bit of a slide that talks about that, but the pictures aren't quite loading. So, um, and it's been really interesting to see kind of the different format of when you explore these different robots. They look different than our traditional practices. Traditionally, we have very large pieces of equipment, but with some of these robots and things like that, they're getting very small to just a few feet wide. So they're very versatile in that sense, and they can be used in different applications rather than just broad scale. Um, but that's just one example of an area where Grand Farm has kind of been able to help support the adoption of different technology. But overall, what we want to do is help test and validate those new technologies um, to support the different challenges we're seeing in agriculture. Um, so that's mainly what I had prepared, but I also wanted to have this as an opportunity to do some Q&A and just kind of have a conversation around what that looks like.
So we were talking about some of this stuff yesterday in terms of like Guernsey. There's two wider challenges. One's 200 or 300 greenhouse sites that are dilapidating that aren't being used yet. We've got a cost of living problem with food and importing a lot of food. The reason why that industry collapsed was cost of labour and cost of energy in terms of heating these greenhouses. And then the secondary issue we have is the sustainability of our dairy industry from a fodder point of view. So those kind of are the two major issues that we were talking about yesterday. So what role do you think innovation can play in solving those issues, and how would you structure an organisation here to do that?
Yeah, I mean, looking at dairy and greenhouses, I mean, um, those are areas where I think starting the conversation is really important to kind of address what is the challenge. And then there's also kind of the exploration and creating ability to test new things, to have a space to trial and experiment with some of the new technologies has been really important. When we think about some of the different barriers for people to innovate and make new technologies in our area. One of that is access to land. So having access to facilities here that kind of allow people to experiment and test the new technologies is really important. One of the things I didn't mention, but earlier was at our test farm, we kind of run it as like a test bed or a playground for people to come and experiment at. And for a lot of the innovators and startups that we have, we try to do it very low cost or free if possible, because we don't want to put any barriers in the sense for that innovation and testing to happen. So I'd say looking at the kind of framing up the problem set and then having the facilities and ability to kind of test and innovate is really important.
One of the things we've not talked about is funding. And so the history of how Grand Farm started from a funding point of view and how it continues, how it's attracted more funding over time.
Yeah, absolutely. So um, funding for Grand Farm comes from a few different channels. First, we have financial funding from some of those different companies and organizations we work with. They support us because they believe in advancing agriculture, and they also are deeply involved themselves. So there's kind of that mutual benefit there as well. Um, but as Grand Farm continued to progress, we've also received a lot of government funding through different competitive grants, through different organizations like that. So, but that slowly happened over time after some momentum got started. More support kind of came on to support Grand Farm. So yeah, we've had a few different government and we have the National Science Foundation grant. And so there's been a few different things like that that have continued to help support Grand Farm. But like I mentioned, we're a not-for-profit organization. So
what kind? 501c what?
501c3. Yeah.
So it is a pure C3.
Yes.
Not a 501. Okay.
Yep. Yep. So nonprofit in nature.
So any guys got any question? What any startups that you're working on? I would say, how would you progress, or how would you get it done within this context?
I've got quite a few questions about your whole thing that you're doing. So for me, technology is one of those topics that I'm kind of wary of, as
Sure.
well as want to embrace to some extent, mainly because some of the technologies that we are stuck with now have done so much damage to the environment, i.e. pesticides,
Yeah.
Monsanto, that sort of stuff. Do you guys, are you trying to adopt technology from a more natural standpoint in terms of non-polluting, or are you is it open? Because I mean, the no-till thing was quite interesting.
Yeah.
That's one of the things that It's unproven. Farmers don't, farmers know that they can plough their fields and chuck pesticides and fertilizers on it, and they'll get the yield that they want potentially. So that's great that you can you're trying to say, like, look, we can prove that this no-till is not working. But yeah, my concern would be, are there some technologies that could be detrimental to the environment, and how do you deal with those?
Yeah.
And to follow on, that was not the same question, but whether you have ethics or values that underpin the technology.
Yeah, I would say a lot of what we're looking at kind of is through the lens of sustainable farming. And yeah, that looks very different than kind of the traditional fertilizer pesticides that are being used. I talked a little bit about some of those weeding robots, and those have been really interesting because those take a non-chemical approach to weeding, or they're used with more limited chemical applications, which is helpful for runoff and pollution in that sense. So that's been really interesting because there's a little bit more pressure to look at some of those solutions from an environmental perspective. And then also I was mentioning some of our weeds are becoming resistant to the chemicals because of so much overuse of those chemicals. They continually adapt. So there's a lot of technologies that are being talked about of how can we kind of mitigate the impacts of the chemicals. I mean, there's uh, some of the crazy ones are like laser weedings, flamethrowers, electrocution. But we've also seen really promising results with just kind of mechanical hose that are guided by computer vision to figure out what is the weed, what's the intended crop, and to remove them without chemicals. We've also seen a lot of like biologics, not quite fertilizers, but different things that can be applied to our crops to help supplement not using as much fertilizer on fields. So one of the companies or one of the startups that we've worked with before was called Chonex, and they make a fertilizer-like application out of chicken manure to be applied to the fields. So we're seeing a lot of different things that kind of are more sustainable in that sense. And that's been one of the things that we're looking at is how do we protect our soils for the long term, and what are the technologies that help us achieve that as well.
So it's definitely technology along with sustainability.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, cool.
Yep. Absolutely.
The other, sorry, the other part of that is nutrition, and we know that the shop bought messages of food are just not as nutritious as food grown in the old traditional way. So, are any of your innovators looking at nutrition and how can we improve nutrition?
A little bit. That's been entering the conversation around like being able to trace, does like healthier soils promote healthier food that's being grown? So that's one thing that we've also been seeing a little bit, and that kind of comes through with a few of the different crops. I mean, our crops are not all for food production. We also have some crops that are grown for animal feed, which certainly health still plays a role in that. We also have some that are grown for energy production, so like ethanol, things like that. And that's also been being looked at through what are the different inputs that maybe yield a greater outcome for that. So that's definitely been one thing that we've been looking at as well, is like what are the things that help support better crops, healthier food, things like that.
I think just to add to that, I think one of the things each innovation lab around the world can do is set itself up around particular challenges and solving things in particular ways. I think one of the things that Guernsey can do quite well is that link between food nutrition and chronic disease reversal, and actually having a slightly, we were talking about this yesterday, slightly differently positioned innovation lab that could do things wider, which the benefit of an island and a system is we can do those things. They find it harder to do in a large system where you've got federal, state, and town legislation and regulation, whereas we've only got one system. So cross-silo stuff between health system and food system is something that innovation lab can be more easily built here than there.
Yeah, and I think kind of going along with that, I mean, um, traceability enters the conversation a lot, and I know that's a very different thing here. I mean, trace like a lot of times being able to see where the food is grown is really important. And we've seen that a lot with kind of our farmers markets, things like that, like being able to buy produce locally. And then that also looks very different for our large scale production as well, because um, there's kind of the whole supply chain that all of that travels through. So, but there's definitely the desire to know like where the food is grown and kind of what are those characteristics that helps promote like healthier food.
Yeah, I mean, you've got in America, you've got huge expanses. So you've got airplanes flying down blanketed places, killing off bugs and things like that. But I mean, you've got three different things. You've got the fertilizer, you've got the bugs, and you've got the rogue plants as well.
Yeah.
So I was down in Australia looking at a place where they were doing a lot of work with trying to focus on just hitting the weeds with the weed killer, not blanket doing that,
Yeah.
which is particularly successful. But we have here a problem called bugs. And when you're in a greenhouse, I've been growing a greenhouse for about 10 years now, the getting rid of those bugs, they are really hardy little critters. And
Yeah.
I'm using American. We won't call them critters. And basically, to try and grow things without the chemicals, which I mean, Guernsey's been notoriously good with using chemicals. Not good, bad with using chemicals, but very successfully using chemicals to kill off nasty bugs with nicotine and all that sort of smoke bombs and all that sort of stuff, which the old boys swear by. Kills them. We don't have anything that seem to be replacing that at all. So when we're talking about greenhouses, the thing that we've got greenhouses, we've got little total areas which have got whitefly infestations, which are really hard to get rid of because they're very resilient to the
Yeah.
So that area is the thing that I think, having grown, as I said, for the last 10, I'm not growing now, but the last 10 years, it's the most, just tear your hair out with it. That's the trouble.
Yeah.
Because you just eat the caterpillars and the pretty little white butterflies, which are great.
Yeah.
In a dark place. But they drive you absolutely crazy. So you think, to hell with this, I've got to do it. And of course, you've got somebody next door to you growing there who doesn't care about that either. So that you're now trying to fend off, and you just want to encapsulate your whole area and say, keep out.
Yeah.
Is there anything going on that line? Because you've got big expenses, within the greenhouse arena. There's a whole. It's completely encapsulated growing place, which we have got. Wholly with birds. I mean, when we bring in birds as well, blackbirds and things like that. So what sort of areas are they working on in that field, which is is small but is also big? Because I mean, there's some huge greenhouses.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm not I don't know any off the top of my head right now, but I mean, kind of thinking around how those different challenges look different in each area. I mean, talking about pests there, I mean, we're growing outdoors, so that's a little bit different. But one of the things that was kind of important for a lot of our growers was we created what we called our grower pain point report. So kind of listing out like all the different challenges, like you were mentioning with pests in the greenhouse, things like that. And once you kind of, I guess, shared what those challenges were, it was kind of an invite for people to kind of look at like, hey, maybe there's a technology over here that could be applied to this. And we see a lot of that coming from sometimes other industries, which has been really interesting. Like I think about one kind of similar example that we had is we have a lot of blackbirds that want to eat sunflower seeds out of our sunflowers. And one of the technologies that was being developed was at airports, they use, they call them like a laser scarecrow to kind of deter birds away from runways. And so last summer we ran a plot or a test trial with using that laser scarecrow to help deter birds. It doesn't kill them. It doesn't have like lasers shooting out of it, but it scares them away, so they stay off of the crop. And through that, initial results kind of showed like yield remained higher because of that technology. But that's an example where once the problem was kind of announced, we people in other industries could go, hey, this might be an application for that.
If you've also got watering, I mean, you've got to have issues with watering because you can get very hot there as well as cold. I mean, so actually,
Yeah.
the use of water, sort of, it's not desert like.
Yeah, I mean, in our area around Fargo, you might see a few like irrigators in the fields, but it's not a really common thing. Um, One of the challenges with irrigation is water rights, so getting access to water, because for certain like streams and aquifers, things like that, there's only so many permits that are given out to kind of help. Uh, I guess water's limited, so being able to allocate that out. But certainly in other parts of the US, there's lots of irrigation that happens. So that definitely is a challenge, especially in dry summers. If we don't have a lot of moisture, that becomes a really tough um, challenge to work through because there really isn't many solutions out there other than watering.
Within a greenhouse, we have a water situation where we have no.
Yeah, yeah.
I just wanted to ask a lot of that with the farming side of things. Are you doing a lot of monocropping? So you've literally only got one crop to worry about, and dealing, like you said, with the sunflowers and the blackbirds. But if you're doing like permaculture, which is its own environment and benefiting a diversity of wildlife and creatures and things all working together, like cabbage white butterflies,
Yep.
the best, and the caterpillars, the best thing to all those is actually sparrows and robins. So we're putting up bird boxes in the greenhouse for those specific. Yes, we want to keep the blackbirds away from the soft fruit, so we're doing a netted soft fruit area to keep blackbirds out of that one.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to ask is the technology that you're designing, is it also suitable for permaculture where you've got multi crops in the same area?
I would say certainly. And a lot of the technology is kind of focused around maybe one thing or like one particular area. So we've definitely seen a lot of it being applied elsewhere, especially in greenhouse applications. Some of the technology is applied there as well. Yeah, to your point, we do have a lot of mono crops being grown, but that's a practice that's looking to slightly shift to be more sustainable in a sense. We have um, a lot of cover cropping is becoming a thing. So the practice of not leaving the fields bare over the winter to help maintain that topsoil instead of blowing away in the wind or things like that. So, or the other practice too is seeding within rows of other crops as well has been a thing. And then to kind of support healthy soil, like rotation of different crop types year after year has been really important because otherwise soil nutrients become depleted and things like that.
You do GM stuff or not?
Like genetically modified. Yeah. Um, yeah.
GM stuff.
Yeah, there certainly is a lot of that grown, and there definitely are. I'd say that's been a really interesting one because there's consumer demand for potentially non-GM products, but then also there's been so many benefits to modified crops, especially from pest and weed resistance, which have been really helpful to promote maybe less chemical applications because they're more resistant to weeds and things like that. So that definitely is something that we're seeing, like the consumer demand is higher for those, but then also there's a lot of benefits to growing the GMO crops. Yeah.
Have you had any pushback from farmers from some of the technologies that you're working in? Like I'm thinking particularly like AI, obviously everyone's worried about that a little bit. And then also the autonomous driving, that's a lot of people's jobs, for instance, or anything else.
Yeah.
Do you ever find pushback from the actual main sort of farmers that know what you're doing?
Yeah, and that certainly is a very valid question, and that's one of the areas where we're trying to show that the technology can be like that's part of the reason why Grand Farm exists is to test and validate the technology because we know a lot of the farmers there's a lot of uncertainty about adopting a new technology or the cost. Like, is this actually going to be effective? So that's an area where we can kind of help de-risk a lot of that. But what we've seen with a lot of the like autonomous technology is it's not necessarily replacing jobs. It's just kind of shifting them in a different way. Um, like with a lot of the robots we're seeing, like there's always someone still watching them because they're not able to fully run on their own, and they probably never will be. Um, like with some of those robots, like potentially the farmer's still watching them, but maybe they're watching like three of them all being run at the same time because they do need maintenance still. They need to be refueled. They need, if it's planting, seed to be refilled. Um, so definitely, like it's not necessarily replacing in that sense. Um,
I think the worry mainly is the transition. Like, as you said earlier about the reducing workforce, that's definitely a thing happening in the future. You know, people are having less children, etc.
yeah,
But it's that transition, isn't it, that's going to be hard for a lot of people. I mean, you look at lorry drivers, for instance, they're worried about their jobs.
yeah.
It's, I just wondered, like, what your thoughts were on the best way to transition into these technologies.
Well, yeah. I mean, it definitely is a transition because sometimes the practices look different. But one thing that's also kind of a unique challenge to our area is kind of the generational change on farms. Um, like our farming population is growing older, and there's less people wanting to enter farming as kind of their career or job. So that's definitely been another thing that's working against us with that worker shortage. Um, so in a sense, like some of the autonomous things are not necessarily replacing, but they're just kind of an opportunity to kind of help supplement the existing um, people working in that industry as well.
Because I mean, mental health is important in farming.
Yeah,
It's,
yeah,
you mentioned earlier it's about mental health here in Guernsey. Farming, it's dire because they're just driving all on their own, whereas there used to be a community doing baling and all that sort of stuff that I remember. But now it's just nothing.
yeah,
In terms of farmer, obviously there's a huge difference between agribusiness, which is it's great big
yeah,
huge areas and so on, to what we have in our minds as prosaic chickens around the door and so on, and mixed crops and all the rest of it. So I think it looks like how much do you say that the innovation you're looking at is big tech to feed the population as opposed to the sort of smaller scale things which makes us
yeah. Well, I think that's what I was kind of sharing about Grand Farm is kind of it's more so built around the framework of taking the challenges and seeing what technology or solutions can solve it. And so, um, like in Fargo, we are focused on that type of agriculture, like larger scale, but I think the same model can be applied elsewhere of the unique challenges that are in the area that it's located. And I think that's one of the reasons why it was so important for Fargo to look at kind of building the center around it because agriculture looks very different on our coastal areas too. I mean, we have more citrus and like specialty crops that are grown in those areas compared to what we have in our region. So part of that was we needed a place to kind of bring all those solutions together and apply it to the challenges that we have in our area. So especially looking at this area, I mean, you can't necessarily just always take technology and solutions from one area and apply it. It needs to kind of be built around the unique challenges that are in it. Yeah, yeah. So it's more so like the framework of thinking about that and being unique to each area.
The framework question.
Yeah.
You mentioned the PMO, which presumably kind of just runs the program of testing out these experiments,
Yeah.
making sure that they can be run. What happens with the innovation pipeline? How do ideas come in, and then how are the ideas kind of sifted, good or bad ideas, and how are they managed into the program?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, so our PMO or Program Management Office, it's kind of like our that's our project part of Grand Farm. And so a lot of that potentially either we have kind of the farmers and growers saying, this is a challenge that we have. What what solutions are out there? So like you're talking about pests, like what problems are out there and what solutions are out there. So through our work with the PMO, if we're kind of given that challenge, we'll go out and do research to try to find things that might be able to solve a particular thing. And then we'll kind of set up and run those tests and experiments on our farm. And after that, like we want to be very open about the results that are gathered through that work and kind of share it out. So we do a lot of tours and bringing people out to see the technology um, while we're in the growing season, and then also sharing the results of that work at the end of the season or the experiment, whatever it is.
Amazing. What sort of scale is that team that manages all
Our team size is about well, it's kind of tricky because we have kind of our parent organization that supports us from like marketing and operations. So total size we'd be about 30 teammates, and then we have about 10 that focus just on Grand Farm as an initiative. So
I'm following on from that actually. You've got, I take it, so you've got the people, the farmers that are saying, right, this is the problem. Then they're taking that to your kind of team, and then you're going out and you're looking at innovators, technology that's coming in saying, right, are they coming to you saying we reckon we could solve this problem with this technology and this technology? And then I assume you're adopting some of them, trialing them. That process, have you factored in, you know, it's your trial, it's not theirs. So the innovators, the tech companies that are coming to you with their technology, you are autonomously testing it yourself separately from them. They're not guiding. I'm talking about corruption.
right?
Sure.
So how do you?
yeah,
Like as a let's say I was an old school farmer and I have used glyphosate my whole life and I haven't no till just doesn't seem like it's going to work for me. Obviously, I'd be really interested in the results of that, but my concern would be that the innovators, the technology companies, had manufactured the results
sure.
to make it seem good, because that's happened historically in the past. As we know, big corporations don't care too much about anything other than money and their shareholders. So do you have any issue? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I would say that's an area where we work kind of hand in hand with the companies to kind of some of it's them, some of it's us kind of running those experiments. Um, I would say where we see probably the most engagement on our trials and projects is with the smaller like startups and companies just getting started, not so much larger corporations in that sense. And so with a lot of like the smaller startups and companies, I should say, they're more so looking for the resources to kind of run an experiment for the first time. So that's something we've seen a lot of as well. And that kind of looks like Grand Farm and that company working together to kind of set up that experiment and run a project. Um, a- some of the larger corporations that are in the agriculture space in the US, a lot of them have their own test farms that they operate and run internally. Um, so it just kind of depends on the exact thing that we're working on.
But you guys, your sort of your charity kind of thing, your organisation, do you have like built into your not kind of terms and conditions, but your own framework, to, things to prevent unethical practices, manipulation of results from third party, so
Yeah.
so that a farmer can rely on your results of your test to trial it on their own.
Yeah, that's it's an area we're not quite in. We're not always producing like scientific research projects out of our work, but like one example of an area that we were involved in about 2 years ago was when carbon capture and all of that was a really popular topic, and there's a lot of satellite companies out there that claimed they could kind of give you the carbon content based on satellite imagery. So that time, one of the projects we ran was getting the results from a certain plot of area um, from the satellite companies, kind of getting the results that they produced through their software and technology. And then we went out and actually pulled like soil cores from those areas to get the actual carbon information from that area and then compare that with the results that the companies were claiming they could produce. So that's one area where like I think kind of gets to your point a little bit around,
you're trying to back it up.
Yeah.
You're saying that you're testing it.
Whether, whether their results are accurate or not, or
Were they accurate?
that one I don't know yet because the results weren't, but that's an area where like we want to continue to build on that of being able to share out those results. So
do you give financial assistance to the small startups, or is it you get support from larger corporates into your pot? Do you then give sponsorship or donations to the companies, the smaller startup companies that are helping you to do the investigating or designing of the technology?
Yeah, what that kind of looks like for us is we certainly have lots of larger corporations that support Grand Farm as a whole. And then how we work with the startups is we try to do everything as low cost or free if possible for the startups because we don't want cost to be a barrier for the startups. So, for example, like if we're out at our test farm and potentially maybe there's like a sensor company that wants to put their technology out there and test it, that's something we could most likely do for free for them. But in certain cases where there's plots being planted, things like that, like the startup would pay for part of the inputs into the field, but nothing else. So we try to do everything at cost or free for the startups because we certainly don't want cost to be a barrier, especially because resources are really limited for them when they're first getting started. Yeah.
But you also, the funding ecosystem, how you use the model to bring that together as well. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah. So just because Grand Farm doesn't necessarily provide funding for those startups and innovators, there are definitely other organizations that we work really closely with, different venture capital investment funds in our area that would be able to take or provide significant capital for the startups to kind of continue their development. So that's one thing that's been really interesting about our region is historically there has not been a lot of those types of funding organizations in our area to support the startups, and that's a really important piece to have kind of that thriving community and ecosystem of innovators. So that's one thing that's definitely changed in the last probably 2 to 3 years. So very recent is some of that was kind of kickstarted by our government. We have a pool of funds that was traditionally just invested as typical investments. And they decided through some policy change that they were going to invest a portion of that fund back into North Dakota startups and ideas. So that significantly changed the availability of those resources for the startups to have that funding available.
Sorry, one more question. So say, for instance, now that this startup company has done some trials and invented some sort of technology that is beneficial, then get their own patent for that technology. How then does that work with Grand Farm and themselves? Do you get a share in the patent?
No, we don't take shares in patents or anything like that. And that's something.
They literally go and fly.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's kind of the role of what we want to be is we want to be the organization that can kind of help support facilitate. And like I said, we're nonprofits, so that's not really our role of to take ownership of the companies or anything like that.
So Nathan has a press interview lined up at this time. The guys talked in the back, so I think if anybody has any desperate urgent, they can quickly ask. If not, we'll thank.
Come over and see us at the greenhouse.
Absolutely, yeah.
There's tea and coffee available. But if we could just, thank Nathan for above and beyond the call of duty, popping over here despite travel chaos, 24 hours of his holiday.